Hey everybody, Tony Bacigalupo here with Gathering Summit. I'm just so grateful to be able to share this conversation with you that I have recorded with Priya Parker, the author of The Art of Gathering. The Art of Gathering has been just such a massively influential book in its short time on the shelves with us and with so many of the people that we've talked to in the course of putting together the summit. So it's an honor to have her along for this conference, and I'm just so excited to share our conversation with you. So without further ado, let's get into my chat with Priya Parker of The Art of Gathering. Priya, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm honored and really excited to have you as a part of this conference.
Thank you for having me. It's a treat.
I have to say, so one of the things that I've been doing with the people I've been interviewing is that I ask them for a book that they recommend. And so many people were recommending your book that I actually had to modify my question.
Oh,
And
that's
now
so lovely.
it's
Well,
true.
I
I
actually,
actually say,
given the title of this summit, if that wasn't happening, there would be something, I'd be worried. These are my people.
for sure. It's so true. So I want to get into a little bit about your background, why you wrote this book, and I guess maybe taking me a little further back. I know in your book you mentioned kind of growing up and your background in conflict resolution. I know that the word activist has been used by you to describe some of the work you've done in the past. So tell me a little bit about, writing a book is a really massively personal and incredible thing to do. So to pick this topic, it has to be, really important to you. So can you tell me a little bit about kind of your background, what drove you to get to the point where you decided this is a book I have to write?
Someone once told me that you shouldn't write a book, or you should only write a book when you have a question that's worthy of pursuit. Writing a book isn't or shouldn't be a vanity project. It shouldn't be a business card. It shouldn't be a kind of, thing to navel gaze. It's an invitation and an ask for other people to spend 12 hours with you, right? 8 hours, 16 hours, depending on how long the book is or how fast or slow you read. And to do that, I think you're honoring both yourself and your reader by making sure that there's a question that's worthy of pursuit. And for me, a question that was worthy of pursuit is, how can we make our everyday gatherings more meaningful? And how can we equip more people to have the tools to do that in an accessible and democratic way? And I come from difference. I write about this in the book, but my mother's Indian and my father's white American. And I was born in Zimbabwe. In the first few years of my life, they would move every 6 or 8 months to different villages in Africa and Southeast Asia and India, then The Hague, like a little Europe in there, and then the US. And we eventually settled in Virginia. And within a year, they separated. Within 2 years, they divorced. And within 3 years, they remarried other people. But they remarried other people that were more matched the thread from which they came. And they had joint custody. So every 2 weeks, I'd go back and forth between these two households. And it was a sort of, Indian, and I write this in the book, but it's true. It's this Indian, New Agey, Democrat, liberal, vegetarian, incense-fueled, like not a metaphor, actually like incense all the time, meditation Sunday family. And then I would go over every other Friday afternoon to my father's house and step into this white evangelical Christian, very American, conservative, meat eating, twice a week church going. I'd spend a summer with my, the church group at my father's home. Through my father's home and the life that I had those 2 weeks, going to like Christian revival camps, in Maryland called Light the Fire. And like these massive, it's a gathering, but these massive basketball stadiums filled with thousands and thousands of teenagers doing like Christian revival stuff. And literally, like one of my memories is at one point in that revival, they passed around a coffin and asked people to put in all of their secular things. And I remember I peeked in and I was like, what is a secular thing? And it was a Nirvana CD. And then I go to my mother's house, and the gatherings in that family were, every winter I'd go to the Theosophical Society in Madras in India, and sit and watch as my grandfather would lead a ritual of 7 religious leaders, starting, various rituals by reading the Quran or reading the, Bhagavad Gita. And so my entire life has always been a kind of a navigating between multiple worlds. And I think, like so many of us, trying to figure out where I fit in and where I belong, and is it worth belonging to something that wants part of your family to disappear? And so these are the questions of my life. And I think, to me, I became a conflict resolution facilitator, but focus on groups, so not one-on-one, really focus on group dialogue. And if you're in this field, as I imagine some of your community is, it's a very interesting question to say, can you set up an experience for a group of people just through conversation, just through dialogue, that by the way you sequence it and by the way you prepare for it can transform their actual relationship, right? Can language change a group? And that's a question to me that's fascinating.
I know that that's something you studied professionally. You talked about that in the book as well. And you're reminding me of something I studied, nonviolent communication, which I imagine you've looked at as well. But the idea that we're all human beings. At the end of the day, we want the same things. And what we want is often not as in conflict as much as we might think. Right. And that if we're able to achieve some degree of understanding of what people really want in their most base way, then odds are really good that we can find ways to kind of get along with each other that we might not have thought were even possible in the beginning. Is that kind of the idea?
I mean, I think one of the things that is interesting in a group context and in a gathering, and particularly when you're trying to gather across difference, or try to connect people and make them feel that they have something in common, but that they don't have to be the same, right? That's deeply important. Can we gather meaningfully and connect without all having to be the same? And I was, one of the gatherers I admire is a woman named Ellen Chus. And she facilitates a lot of groups, but one of the groups, she's not in the book, is basically, I forget what she called, a birth preparation class, right? So again, gathering, usually 4 couples or 6 couples, right before you're going to actually give birth. At least I was pretty freaked out. And it's a 6-week course, 3 hours, 3-hour classes. And she would basically facilitate us through this process to prepare, which is a really intimate thing to do in front of other people, right? This is a complicated gathering that doesn't look complicated. And she said I remember at one point she asked everybody, do you want an epidural? So there may not seem like in pregnancy and birth there's a lot of conflict, but within mom circles there actually is a lot of conflict and controversy. And part of the controversy is around the role of a mother, but also the role of the body. And there's a huge disagreement about whether or not to get an epidural, right? Whether to get this entire needle into your body during birth. And there's movements to have natural births, home births, no drugs. Then there's movements that are, against that. You wouldn't imagine that there's this much conflict here, but there is. And she said, how many of you absolutely do not want epidural for your birth? And the majority of the room raised their hand. And then how many of you absolutely want an epidural? You think it is totally nuts to try to do this alone. And then, 2 of us, myself included, was like, yep, that's me. And then in this kind of issue that can be polarizing and demonizing, and thinking like, oh, they don't care about what the drugs could do for the baby, or, oh, they're not tough enough, or, oh, they don't, right? All of these judgments that we then see. She said, what each of you want is control over your experience. And those that want an epidural tend to want a level of control and believe that that without the drugs, the pain is going to be so strong and overwhelming that you will lose control. And on the other hand, those who don't want the epidural believe that to be actually in control means to have full use over one's body and not have drugs. And to me, this was like this fascinating example of, to go to your point, yes, we all need the same thing. In this context, a sense of control over a pretty chaotic experience with a lot of pain. but the way in which we interpret that need can demonize one another. And I think the most beautiful gatherings and the strongest facilitators are those that are able to do what Ellen did in that moment, which is to help us see our common need, but our different interpretations of what that might look like in our life.
That makes a lot of sense. And I feel like if the more that we're able to facilitate just people understanding even the notion that that's possible, like what you just described, this idea of, hey, you have opposite views. You're probably all judging each other right now.
So much judgment.
Let me blow your mind, because it turns out that in this core way, you want the same thing and you're just interpreting it in a different way. And actually, once you look at it that way, you can at least understand, even if you don't agree, you can at least understand why the other person thinks the way they do.
Completely.
And in this world right now, with all of the madness that is going on the internet and all of the divisiveness and the vitriol and the separateness that's going on, I feel like the hunger and the need for this antidote that we're describing is just growing and growing.
I think that it's, there are many reasons, I think, why we are coming apart. Many of them structural and economic. And then on top of that, there are elements overlying them related to identity. And then on top of that, technology, right? We're in a very complicated mess right now. And I think, just to step back a bit, part of, I believe one of the reasons why we have increased loneliness and lack of connection, one is because, we need to sometimes gather more with people who are different from us, but also we sometimes need to gather less. Many of the gatherings, the book I wrote is called The Art of Gathering. It's not called The Art of Gathering More. It's about gathering better. And I think one of the dangers of gathering is you go to a dinner party or a town hall or even a school picnic. You're like, okay, I'm good. I'm here. I'm willing to show up. And then nothing happens. Or worse, you feel kind of really awkward and no one has kind of welcomed you, and everybody's on autopilot, kind of looking over one another's shoulders, trying to figure out if a better conversation is happening somewhere else. And so I think we can actually gather in ways, and that's a light example, but that actually also keep us apart. And so I think, when you zoom out and look at kind of the overwhelmingness of the world, it can be a little overwhelming. And I think part of what I'm arguing for in this case is to think about what creates a transformative gathering anytime you host something. And to not think that you have to have a PhD in experience design or, fireworks or kind of all of this accoutrements to be able to gather well. You need to actually clear a lot of that stuff away and just simply start with a specific question, which is, what is a need in my life or in this community's life that by bringing a specific group of people together, we might be able to address? And right. I think so many of the gatherings that we have right now kind of skip any questions around purpose. And the echo chambers that exist online, at some level, don't even make sense, because there hasn't been a frame or a structure that has said, this is why we're here, this is what we're about.
Yeah, and to make kind of safe or brave room for that conflict to arise through us figuring out how to work towards that solution as a group together, right? And I think what you're talking about speaks to kind of this trend that I'm seeing. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in this in New York in particular is because New York is a city where there's lots of stuff going on every single day, and yet where loneliness is rampant. Yeah. So we've got a big kind of a nice little big petri dish to look at here, and a lot of that comes back to, well, a lot of these events, a lot of these gatherings that are happening don't have that element of connection or don't have a lot of the components that you describe in the book. Whereas now we're seeing a movement, really, I think, growing of different kinds of programs. One of our guests, Jillian Richardson, who runs the Joy List, has a newsletter where she puts out.
Newsletter.
Yeah, her newsletter is great, but her way of curating that newsletter is that every program has an element of meaningful connection to it. Mm-hmm. So it's not just something that you show up, you consume the content and you leave. There's some other component. And as a result, you could pretty much bet that every event that you see on her list is going to be a really, really good one to go visit. And there are so many more of them that are growing and starting to happen now. And so I'm wondering, I guess, about the timing. Do you think that there's something happening that's causing this shift now in the way that people gather, that's causing this kind of, new form, not new form, but kind of that we're paying attention to this better way of gathering? Why now? Why is this word gathering such a big deal for you, for me, for these other people?
Well, I mean, I think Casper and Angie write about this really well. I think that our traditional forms of meaning and the traditional institutions from which they used to come are no longer relevant or trusted. And whether that's church, or whether that's, frankly, government, or whether that's a company, right? You work for 30 years in the same company and it's a source of meaning, and you gather with the same people, and that's who you socialize with on weekends. And then at the end, you get the silver watch, right? It's not reality anymore. It's not relevant. And yet, we all still want meaning. And so I think there's been a bit of a crisis of meaning, for good and bad, to say, from where do we seek meaning now? I think it's a dangerous question, and I think it's a remarkable question. And I think one of the ways that we have always sought meaning is through gathering. But I think one of the things that's changing is our assumptions about who can gather legitimately, right? You don't need to be a rabbi. You can be a rabbi, and there are certain rabbis like Amichai, Levi, who I know you're speaking with this week as well, who is gathering in remarkable ways, and who is drawing lines that are, allowing God-optional communities to come in, but agree to pursue the sacred together. That's really interesting. But I think that one of the elements of transition in our gatherings is the assumption of where and who has power, who has authority, who has legitimacy to convene, has been broken up, right? There's the monopoly has been has been broken, and there's danger to that, and there's a lot of progress to that. And I think part of the field that's starting to develop more consciously, I mean, facilitators have existed for, time millennia, it's just called different things. But I think the field that you're starting to, explore, and that we're all tapping into, is this realization that, like, oh God, if they're not in charge, any of us can be. So what is the responsibility that comes with this? How do we gather in meaningful ways? What does it mean to be legitimate? What is the social contract I'm inviting people into? And who gets to decide?
It sounds like the answer is, to some degree, is up to all of us to kind of ponder and try to figure out for ourselves in our own communities. Like,
the reason I think
right now I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. The reason I think gathering is so interesting as a unit is because gathering is culture formation. Gathering is meaning making. Gathering is the creation and translation of norms, right? But we just don't necessarily think of it that way. When you're coming to a birthday party, what people laugh at, what people, say in their toast, what people think is funny, those are all implicit values and norms as to how we are, how we be. Even frankly, the state of Virginia has been in a bit of a mess over the last few months for a lot of different reasons. And I went to the University of Virginia. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I've been paying attention to this conflict. And one of the things that's been interesting is how many leaders were at parties 30 years ago wearing blackface, right? The idea that the way we gather doesn't matter, or the way we gather doesn't allow us to either think that subtly something's okay or not okay, is not seeing. And so I think what we're starting to wake up to is that whether it's a courtroom, or whether it's the New York Times page one meeting, or whether it's the birthday party that you host, each time you draw a circle, you allow and invite people in, and you decide how to spend your time together, you're creating culture.
And that's really where a lot of the most lasting impact comes from, is from local communities, local gatherings, right? That culture builds over time. And one of the beautiful things now with the internet is that if somebody's doing a great gathering in one place, it's easy for that story to be told and for maybe people to learn from that, be inspired by it, do something similar elsewhere.
Absolutely. And you see examples of like that all over the world. I mean, I think the dinner party is a beautiful example of that, and bringing 20-somethings and 30-somethings to allow to put grief at the center of the table and not to avoid it. I think that 15 toasts is an example that has from my life, where and this is something you can like literally do tomorrow, rather than having a group of people come together and kind of have a night together. You choose a specific theme, the kind of darker, more complicated, the better. And at some point in the evening, you ask people to stand up, ding their glass, old school style, and share a story or an experience from some time in their life that nobody around the table knows that relates to that theme. And the only other rule is that the last person has to sing their toast. Like that, this has now been done in all types of contexts all over the world, and anybody can do it. You have to invite a group of people who want to do it or be game for something. But I think one of the things that's been very interesting is structures are replicable. You need to make sure that they match your need, right? If you may not want to choose a specific format that doesn't work given your context, but basically we can inspire one another to think about, like, how do you rethink the baby shower? How do you, I have a friend who, rather than hosting a baby shower, she and her husband threw a massive day rave. And they thought, like, we don't need more stuff, right? These rituals are based on assumption of a long time ago when people got married at the beginning of their life and actually needed a lot more help than they would if they're 35 and having a baby. We don't assume that mothering is the only parent, right? And we think that the father also needs a ritual. And we also think that part of being a parent and being a family is we want to go into the world and show that you can both have children and still be alive. So we're going to throw a rave, right? And then people hear that idea and be like, I want to do a rave for my baby shower. Why am I pinning the diaper on the donkey?
Yeah. And part of why I'm so excited about this event that we're doing is that we get to share some of those stories. So if somebody's got that thing, copy it. Right? Like, learn from it and go take it and do more with it, which is so cool.
Mm-hmm. I would just say, like, just to double click on that, I think copy it and honor it. So I think part of what a field becomes a field actually not when it's informal, but when it's formal. And if and as we're building this field and want it to become a thing, it's actually important to see the specific invention or innovation, to give it a name, to say, I'm borrowing this from the dinner party, or I'm borrowing this from the feast, or this is a fascinating innovation I saw from, I Am Here days, versus just doing the same thing and saying, like, yeah, it's all the same. And I think part of the, and every field kind of goes through this growth or this growing pains, is to be comfortable naming and giving structure to forms, because when you give them structure and names, they are seeable. And when they are seeable, they're able to be transferable with integrity. And I encourage everybody to do that, but to really honor one another's creations and inventions and then do them.
I completely agree. And it's something that I've been looking at as well with this is to, not just have it be something where you're kind of, taking the sketch of it and then taking and running it with it, but actually being able to coordinate among the people who have themselves something in common. So, for example, Creative Mornings, which I know you spoke at, Creative Mornings has an amazing chapter-based structure, and the people who organize Creative Mornings programs around the world probably have a lot in common in terms of their passion and interests, and they have a lot that they can teach each other and a lot they can contribute to making the collective program better over the course of time. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of being able to name gives you the opportunity to coordinate between the people so they can connect and collectively make all of their programs better.
Absolutely.
So I love that.
Again, like, this isn't, I don't want to sound like we're inventing the wheel here. This has been true in, the dialogue field for at least 30 years. Like, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation has like a entire list that has been curated over many years of, open source technology, open space technology, nonviolent communication, like all of these various story circles, the moth, all of these various inventions that people have that say, hey, look here. But, I had my mentor, Hal Saunders, was an American diplomat, and he I trained under him. He was sort of like how I got into this field, and his process is called sustained dialogue. And it's a 5-stage process for groups that are in conflict to try to change their relationships. And he'd speak all over the world. And I was his I was very young. I was in college, and then I was out of college, and I would often accompany him. And people afterwards would rush the stage and be really excited to kind of meet this giant in the field. He helped draft the Camp David Accords, and they'd come up and they'd almost always say the same thing. You do what I do. And he'd get really frustrated. And he says, I don't do what you do. I want to hear about what you do, but it's not the same thing. And he'd often say, when you collapse distinctions, you can't actually see what it is that we're doing. You can't learn from it because you believe, oh, this is all kind of the same. And I think similarly, like this is a more and more, I think, than ever before, as even the idea of a facilitator is getting democratized, that we should and all be gathering all of the time. It's really important to also begin to understand, like, what's a structure that works, in which context, how should I use this, and who invented it? Because it helps us see and better understand, each other and the differences.
So we've looked a little bit into what makes a gather, like a good gathering as opposed to more gatherings. I'm curious if you've got some perspective on what makes for something that's sustainable long term, and maybe some thoughts on the growing of something. If I'm running a great thing, I want to be able to kind of buy into what you were just talking about around, like letting other people run similar things in their cities. Any thoughts on kind of long-term sustainability and growth for a good gathering concept?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. The first thing is, I think the gatherings that exist over time are relevant because they know the need they're trying to fulfill, even 7 years in. And they know the purpose that they have, even if the purpose changes, 7 years in or 10 years in. And so what I would say is, first of all, if you have hosted a gathering 4 times in a row, or 4 years in a row, and people aren't signing up, or every year you have 90% of the same people leave, and you have 10% of the same people, but basically every year you're starting all over again, all these new people are coming. Maybe if your purpose is, let me get to as many people as possible, that's good. But if you're trying to build a community, there's something that you're doing that is making people say, I don't need this again, right? And so the first question I would ask, both internally and externally, to those who come is like, why do you come? And those who, more interestingly, don't come is why did you leave? And, I met a woman a couple of weeks ago who wanted to get together her neighbors in her neighborhood to be more neighborly. And she sent out a flyer and on her community board, and 8 people arrived, and people were kind of warm and excited, and they had a nice time. And then she's like, great. So, once a Sunday and, once a month. So the next month came around, and that time it was 6 people. She's like, well, I thought we wanted to be neighborly. And then the next month came around, and 4 people, 2 of whom were her best friends. And she's like, what's going on here? And what she realized was being neighborly is a nice thing to have, but it's not more important than being with my children or being with my best friend. It's too vague and amorphous. And so I said to her, why don't you go around and ask your neighbor, what is a need around which you think would be worthy of gathering? Is there anything we actually need to do together, or is this kind of connection for connection's sake? And to actually face that question and not be embarrassed, if people are coming or not, the communities that last over time continue to be relevant and to hit a need, even if the need changes.
Yeah, and you need to be able to. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. People's lives are constantly changing, right? We're humans, so our hopes and needs are just constantly in flux. And yeah, I found that if you kind of stay with what you thought that it was, that eventually people's lives will change and it won't be in alignment anymore unless you have some kind of a rhythm for re-engaging people. And
and I guess what I would say is particularly gatherings that happen over time, you need some amount of heat or frisson. You need something that is exciting and kind of bubbly, and it's not the same old, right? Esther Perel is a relationship expert. She talks about this within families, but it's very difficult to have safety and desire coexist, right? Like once you're deeply known, can you also have the excitement of not being known? And like, that's the $1 million question of marriage. I think gatherings in many ways are the same way, like over and over and over again. It's like meatloaf again. And I think you need to, and so part of that is there's many ways to make something interesting. So I know of a guy in Berlin for 25 years, talk about a repeated gathering. For 25 years, on the 13th of every month, he hosts an Arabiata night. For
Okay.
25 years, talk about a repeated gathering, right?
Yeah.
And his rules basically, as if you're a friend or a friend of a friend, or somehow you figured out, that this night exists, like come on by and I will serve you Arabiata. And I've heard about this gathering from multiple people, in part because the frisson there is you never know who's going to show up. And that's enough, right? It's not the same 12 people committing over and over and over again. It might be literally somebody's like cousin from, Beijing, and it might be somebody's, your 80-year-old neighbor. But the frisson, it's a simple frisson, but it's basically like he has created this container, this structure, and sometimes it's 2 people, sometimes he's alone, and sometimes it's 40. And he has frozen tomatoes in the freezer that if there's like 40, he throws more into a pot that night. But in that case, it's a repeated gathering, not because he's trying to, create meaning for everybody explicitly, but because this is kind of a monthly ritual that enough people think is kind of interesting. And the frisson is like who might show up. And there's a focus, which is the Arabiata, but the Arabiata is kind of like the excuse, right? It's a social crutch. But your frisson might be something else. I think with the dinner party, and I haven't been to one, but from what I've heard, whether you go multiple times or part of a community that keeps repeating or not, like everybody's grieving story is different. And grief is complicated, and there's many stages of it, and it happens at different points of a lifetime. And so even though the focus is kind of the same over and over again, the stories that come out each night, they might rhyme, but they're still different, or they might hit you in a certain specific way, or you may get something out of it that you wouldn't have gotten before. So it's not that you have to change the topic every time, but it needs to be complicated enough that there's some amount of, the unexpected, or conflict, or taboo, or transgression, or something that allows there to be a there for people to want to come back, in part because we're so busy.
Yeah, and I feel like that's as easy as looking for those opportunities the way you're describing, or even looking into yourself, because as the host, the organizer, the gatherer, your story is changing over time too, and so you need to kind of incorporate your own storyline into it. And understand that you're not going to necessarily be the one who's being the organizer for 25 years.
Yeah.
There is a time for you to bring up other leaders as well.
And that gatherings can end. It's okay to end something, to stop doing something when it no longer, rather than beating a dead horse, be like, there's not a need here anymore. When I first moved to New York, my husband and I, we had a desire to learn New York as a city, and also to not get stuck in like the rut of 3 neighborhoods, which we had told a lot of people do. And so we started exploring very simply one Saturday a month, a neighborhood, and a friend joined. We hadn't expanded it to be a gathering. A couple of friends joined, and we started calling them I am here days, and some natural kind of organic rules developed, and we experimented with them. But basically people showed up on a Saturday. There was one person who was in charge, the curator of the day. Sometimes it was me, sometimes it was a local, sometimes it was someone else. And the rules were you have to turn your phone off, no phones, for 12 hours. You need to come on time and stay the whole time. Meals are 1 conversation, and the biggest groups were 8. There's often like 4 or 6, sometimes 10. And you need to be game for whatever the host wants. And we did, 23 of these, Harlem, the Upper West Side, Red Hook, Staten Island. No, we never did Staten Island.
It's a lot of neighborhoods.
A lot of neighborhoods. And then we had kids, and like going around for 12 hours with like 2 tiny people doesn't work, right? At least at this phase in our life, it doesn't work. And that's okay. But there's a model here that, is being tried out in other cities, that being experimented with, because there's a moment in our life where we wanted to be on foot, where we wanted to meet new people, where other people found this need to be relevant and interesting. We wanted to collide with the world that we were in. And for, 3.5 years, that was a very, very deeply relevant, meaningful gathering that might come back again for us and may not. And that's okay.
I love that because I feel like so often we get caught up with the idea of perpetuity. And I feel like perpetuity is kind of an enemy of building a good community because we're not going to do this forever. The community is not going to last forever. There is going to be a time for it to end. And I feel like also it lowers the barrier. If you say, well, I want to do a monthly thing. Well, I don't know if I can do a monthly thing forever. Well, don't. Can you say I'm going to do a monthly thing for 3 months or
Yes.
6 months? You know?
Yes. And I mean, part of it, my last chapter is called Accept That There Is an End. And I think part of we avoid endings. We're embarrassed sometimes about like gatherings that peter out, meaning over time, right? It's like, oh, like maybe I'll just dip out slowly. I'll give an example. Recently, I was speaking with a friend's mom who's part of a gourmand group. And this was apparently a thing that was like really big in the 80s and 90s, where neighbors and friends would meet every month and like cook a really challenging meal together. And usually couples, so like 6 couples. This was a woman who lives in Colorado, and she and her husband were part of a gourmand group for like 20 years. And they're aging, and they're now in their 60s, and this group was really relevant for a long time, very close friends. And recently and a few of them are in their 70s, and recently one of them basically said, this is really tiring. It's exhausting to cook like this. Let's go out. Let's do it at a restaurant. And some of the others were like, oh, it changes the dynamic at a restaurant, but I still want to see the people. Like, okay, let's go to a restaurant. So then like they went to a restaurant, but like a couple of people canceled. No one had ever canceled before, right? And then they went to a restaurant the next time. They're like, well, why are we spending all this money, right? There's like it was starting to like not be as relevant because they were in a different phase of life. And so I said to this woman, she's like, it's kind of awkward, what do we do? And I said, rather than letting it peter out, what if you like host a funeral for the gourmand group, right? Like, or why don't you have like and call it the Last Supper, right? And it's like own and honor. And all of a sudden she was like, she lit up, and she was like that. And you could also feel people's like resistance and be like, no, I don't want it to end. I don't want it. It's like, no, this has an ending. And to honor its life, we need to close it and then walk away, right? Rather than this like dribbling out. It's like the ghosting of a gathering. They're like, finally there's like one person ordering whatever at a restaurant and being like, where'd everybody go?
Yeah, well, and you've mentioned you mentioned conscious uncoupling in one of your other interviews for relationships, and the idea of, again, coming back to these kind of basic rituals, funeral, the idea of having some time to acknowledge a closure. And we used to do this at my co-working space. My friends at the space ran a thing called Startup Funeral, because there's all these
that is
parties,
awesome.
but you never have a party for what a startup ends, and it was amazing.
So beautiful.
Macabre.
And was that because it didn't work, or because they grew, or either way?
Well, I think it was mostly ones that closed or ended or whatever. But some of them, they sold to another company, and it was years later, and you got to hear how they closed the loop, what they learned from it, what happened next, where you went from there. And it helped to make it a little less scary to think, well, hey, this business is going to go away one day, but then I'm going to go do something else, right? And I've done this with conscious uncoupling. I've done this with closing my own space. And it's important because you, as the leader, need to process this, but then the other people need kind of a chance to process it as well. And really the closure of a thing, everybody needs to move through that as a group. And I guess, also you can make that a decision you make continuously. So, even for example, like Creative Mornings, they have kind of their year that they plan out. And I imagine at some point they can get together and say, do we want to keep doing this next year? If, let's decide, let's not just assume because it's a big deal, we definitely want to keep doing it. Okay, yes, we do want to keep doing it. Why? What do we want to change to align with that?
Yes.
That kind of thing.
And that question, is the difference between gatherings that go on autopilot, not in a good way, and gatherings that remain relevant, is to keep asking, do we want to do this? Why? What is the need that we are now trying to fulfill? Even if the need has changed from, right? When Tina started it, she'd moved to New York. She was Swiss, she still is Swiss. And she kind of wanted to meet other creatives. And part of that is still true, but it's also evolved into a number of other, interesting purposes that other people have brought to it. And yet it's maintained its core relevance, right? It's sort of for creatives. And I think a huge amount, one of the problems or challenges with success is we don't stop to ask, is this still working for me?
Yeah. Yeah. And that acknowledging that it can take, or the energy from it can take other forms. There could be other leaders, there could be other spin-off programs that come from it, all those things.
Yeah, I remember when Mad Men went into its, I think, sixth season or fifth season, I heard somebody who knew TV well that said they didn't know when to end. And I loved it because it was sort of like never leave a party while it's still going, or like leave it when it's like cut it when it's still good, which is you want to. All gatherings, when people come together, have a certain amount of life, right? One of the people I interviewed for the book is a curator from TED named Bruno. And one of the things he said to me was, I said, are you worried that people will try to copy TED? And he was like, people try to copy it all the time. But the reason why it doesn't matter, we're not threatened, is because every gathering has its own unique organic chemical composition. And it gets created, and that composition, the chemistry gets shifted and shaped over time, particularly if, like TED, you've been around for 25 years, you're tweaking, you're prodding, like it's not replicable because there's 1,000 decisions that went into it that were made by the specific people in that room. And I think similarly, like whenever you're doing anything that is relevant to your need, to your community, it should be its own, it has its own form of energy, and you should also keep that amount of energy contained, tighten it, and then close it. Once it starts getting deflated, like you should have just kept that density of energy in a tighter container.
Makes sense. And, and over time, your own desires and needs change too. So you need to be able to kind of manage that, because especially, so this is one of the things as we kind of close this container, come down to the last few.
Meta.
I'm curious about the fact that, you're a gatherer. You do this professionally, but I'm sure you do it personally as well. There's always something new around the corner. So are you working on any gatherings now, or are there any things that you're kind of playing with, or even ideas that you're dreaming of, and any fresh tricks that you're thinking of or dreaming of incorporating into the next thing you gather?
I have been dreaming about and experimenting with reimagining the American town hall. And I have been fortunate over the last 6 months to travel around the country in a lot of various cities and towns. And I do all of my book talks as experiences. And so rather than just talking about gathering, whether it's 50 people or 450 people or 3,000 people, I create an experience for that community in which they, through a series of questions, and it's all mic'd up, they begin to actually talk and share, but collectively, right? And in part because I'm a facilitator first and foremost, before that I'm an author or a writer or speaker. And what's been really interesting to me is experimenting in public spaces. So I did this recently at a library outside of Denver. I did this in the Philadelphia Convention Center for the Arena, which is sort of this public-facing civic engagement organization, is to ask when and how we get together in public places, in free spaces. How do we begin to talk about, when we don't necessarily, frankly, the town hall doesn't have the same relevance as it used to, that kind of like the iconic Four Freedoms, Norman Rockwell painting of like the image of the town hall in, New Hampshire or Vermont, and people, publicly participating and talking to their mayor or city council. What would it look like for us to reimagine and facilitate massive public town halls that aren't necessarily to put forward a vote, but are to ask and pursue questions together that are seen as quote unquote divisive, but in front of each other, facilitated out loud, perhaps even magnified across the country, to begin to explore things like, what does it mean to be American? What is the loss of privilege actually mean? What do we actually do after Me Too? What do we do with these men? How do we, like all of these questions that happen behind closed doors, I think I'm really interested in how do we safely and publicly, ideally in a free way, find 21st century solutions and designs to 21st century questions.
All right, and that kind of leads me to my last question for you before we wrap up. I know you have to go, which is, so this is a virtual conference, but you can imagine we've got at least 600 or more people watching this right now, and we're in a giant auditorium. And these are all pretty much all people who are running communities or running spaces that are homes to a bunch of communities. A lot of these people have been in this a long time, but they're all people who care about this notion of gathering. And they probably care about it for a really personal reason, or at least because they really believe in something. And so one of the things I'd like for us to leave this conversation with is just your message of encouragement to the people who are in this room right now watching. And that's just you to them, the people who are watching this now. What would you say to them as a message of encouragement?
I think don't be afraid to be disputable. Don't be afraid to draw lines in the sand about what you're for and what you're not for, what your gathering is for and what your gathering is not for, what you stand for and what is not, for this time. I think many of our gatherings suffer not from unhealthy conflict, but from unhealthy peace. I think many of our gatherings don't suffer from abuse, they suffer from anemia, right? So without life, without blood. And what I mean by that is, gathering when it's powerful is somebody sticking their neck out and saying, I think this is worthy of our collective time and attention. And I think as you do that, to listen to the voices of your community, it's not saying you have to be, a dictator, but you can be a little bit of a dictator. But to be a dictator, to be a generous, I talk about to be a generous source of authority, to know what your purpose is, to be okay that not everybody agrees with it, and then to connect your guests around it, to protect them and to equalize them. And if the purpose is no longer relevant, then you've actually done your job and you should ask what the next purpose is. But I think one of the ideas of facilitators is that we need to be neutral. And I think the most interesting gatherings have a strong point of view.
Well, you've done your job by sitting down with me for this interview and going through it all, and I'm very grateful for it. And I think this whole event is better for your work and for everything that you've done to kind of raise the profile of what gatherings are really capable of. So thank you, Priya, for that, for your work and for taking the time to sit with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Keep up the great work.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. So that was my conversation with Priya Parker. So grateful she took the time to chat with me. Just a couple of quick follow-ups. Priya is launching a new newsletter. So go to her website, priyaparker.com, sign up for her newsletter. Super excited to see where she's headed next. You can also, of course, find her book, The Art of Gathering, everywhere. And check out her Instagram as well. She is on Instagram and she's at Priya Parker.